with that, I think it's really vitally important to stay connected, to be connected, to lend voice, to participate, to understand and figure out how I could help individually and collectively as part of the Rotary organization contribute positively to the dialogue that's happening versus the divisiveness that's happening.
Welcome to the Rotary Club of Milwaukee. I'm Club President Darren Miller, President and owner of JM Construction. As we gather virtually today, we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Jim McLean, Deputy Director of the Milwaukee VA Medical Center, is scheduled to give our invocation today. Jim was experiencing a bit of a technical difficulty with his audio. So if Jim is still experiencing that difficulty, we'll close our program with his invocation. I'd like to say thank you to Karen Hung for her contribution to our Rotary Now More Than Ever video series that played before the program. If you missed it, it will also play at the adjournment. I also would like to give a strong thank you to all of our Rotarians who volunteered at Feeding America this past Friday afternoon. We are proud to support this organization to make a difference in our community. Be on the lookout for more information soon about spring cleanups in April with the Johnsons Park Neighborhood Association and also with the Milwaukee Riverkeepers. This Thursday, our noon snack program will feature Rotarian Alex Chu, realtor with Keller Williams Milwaukee North Shore. He'll be talking about the current trends in residential real estate. We'll open up the Zoom at 11:30 for informal conversations prior to the program starting at noon. 2 weeks ago, we had a moment of silence for the passing of fellow Rotarian Warren Croonan. His family had designated our scholarship program as the recipient of his memorial donations. To date, nearly $12,000 of donations have been sent in to us. It's with warm heart that we say thank you to all of you for your generosity. And now I'd like to introduce Rob Henkin, President with the Wisconsin Policy Forum, who will be introducing our speaker for today. Rob?
Thank you, President Darren, and thanks to all of you. It's nice to see so many of my fellow Rotarians who I haven't seen for a while. As one who was born and raised in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is a Commonwealth that takes tremendous pride in its private colleges and universities, I can attest that one of the attributes that most impressed me when I moved to Wisconsin 26 years ago was the quality and the affordability of our public university system. In fact, I was shocked when I saw the cost of tuition at our UW system schools and the depth, breadth, and quality of their academic offerings, and then compared our system to the public university system in my home state, where it was considered, quite frankly, a second-class citizen. And boy, was I glad to be a Wisconsin resident when our oldest son reached his senior year in high school and was accepted into UW-Madison, his #1 choice. My East Coast friends and relatives would be floored to see what a wonderful undergraduate education my kid received at a cost they could have only dreamed of for themselves and their children. While I get the impression that most native Wisconsinites share this appreciation, it also seems that those who have not lived elsewhere may take it a bit for granted. And that's one reason that I and my colleagues at the Wisconsin Policy Forum felt it was important to assess the state of our public universities and colleges in light of the fierce fiscal challenges facing our state and the many difficult decisions that have been made over the past several years regarding state funding support and tuition. Late last year, we released Falling Behind, an in-depth report that reviews the history of higher education in Wisconsin, its outcomes compared to other states, the limits that have been placed on its revenues, its recent enrollment declines, and the system's highly centralized governance and structure. That full report is available on our website. And this afternoon, we want to share with you its highlights. And to do that, I'm going to turn our virtual podium over to the lead author of the report, Forum Research Director Jason Stein. Jason joined our staff in May 2018 after 13 years as a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and the Wisconsin State Journal, where he covered state and local government budgets and finance. His work was recognized by several national journalism groups, and Milwaukee Magazine named him one of the city's most influential media figures in 2015. Jason also happens to be a Badger himself, having received his master's in journalism from UW-Madison. He has been an outstanding leader of the forum's research staff, and it is now my honor to introduce him this afternoon. So let's give a warm virtual Rotary welcome to Jason Stein.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you. So we'll be talking today about the report Falling Behind. We'll be looking at data that in many cases comes from before the pandemic, but we'll be doing our best to try to put things into the really radically altered context that we're all living in now. And so to start out with, we'll talk a little bit about the funding that's available for the state's university system, in particular, the funding that it has the greatest discretion for the UW-Madison and UW system leaders. In other words, the funding with the least strings attached, because that can drive so many things within their budgets. All right. So here you see the biggest priorities within the state's main fund. What has happened to them spending from those priorities for the last generation? And what you can see is that in the late 80s and as recently as the early 90s, the University of Wisconsin system was the second largest priority within the state's general fund, second only to K-12 education. And what you see is that today it's in fifth place, and it's been supplanted by, in particular, Medicaid, which during the 2000s and the last 20 years has really grown very significantly. Property tax credits, which are another major priority for the state these days, as well as our correction system that particularly during the 90s and 2000s grew quickly. Schools also grew, during the 90s and 2000s as a share of the overall total state spending. They've been down somewhat over the past decade. But there you can see sort of how UW has sort of lost the fight in some way for the overall state funding pie. Now, the other big source besides state tax dollars of discretionary funds for the UW system is the tuition that they charge students and families. And since 2014, we have had an in-state undergraduate tuition freeze in place in Wisconsin. So essentially, tuition is frozen at 2013 levels. The governor is proposing to continue that in the next 2-year state budget. But here you can see from 2013 to 2020, what's happened to tuition and fees at UW-Madison. And you can see that for in-state undergraduates, they've barely risen at all. All of that increase that you see there, that 3% increase, is in fees. The tuition has remained the same. And what we're doing here is we're comparing UW-Madison to 35 other peer public research institutions around the country, as well as just the rate of inflation over those years. And you can see that UW-Madison had the third lowest increase in tuition over those years. So in other words, if you think about what was the goals of the tuition freeze that was passed by the legislature, the goal was to hold down the cost of tuition for students and families. And you can see that that has been achieved over time. We'd see a similar thing if we just compared all 4-year universities in Wisconsin to public 4 years to other public 4 years around the country. Now, some of you might say, well, look at the University of Wisconsin-Seattle. They actually had a decrease in tuition, and that is true. But the difference is that the University of Washington-Seattle received a significant infusion of state tax dollars that helped to buy down tuition. Whereas over these years, UW-Madison has seen its state tax funding, under pretty tight controls. There hasn't been that increase that you saw at UW-Seattle. So that's another reason why UW-Madison stands out when you look at, or the system as a whole stands out when you look at it nationally. So here we see on a per student basis, funding for all public higher ed institutions in Wisconsin. So this would be both the 4-year and 2-year schools within the UW system, as well as our 2-year Wisconsin Technical College System schools. And what you can see here is that on a per student basis, tax and tuition funding in Wisconsin has fallen compared to other Midwest states. Now, this is national data that gets reported for Wisconsin by the UW system to a national higher ed entity. And, you know, if I were in charge of this data, there's actually some local property tax revenue that I would probably add. So if I were doing this chart, if I was doing the data, I think Wisconsin would probably start a little bit higher than the current 4th place, and it would end up not necessarily in last place, you know, maybe in 3rd to last or something like that. So I don't want you to get too hung up on what place we're at, but the bottom line is that either way, you see this decline in our standing in per student funding compared to other Midwest states, as both the effects of holding pretty tight controls on both tuition and state tax dollars have taken effect over the past 20 years. All right, so that what I was just showing you was funding on a per student basis. But, you know, the number of students is not constant. It changes over time. And so what's been happening with enrollment? So let's look at that. What you see is that during the late 90s and 2000s, you really had significant growth in enrollments on a full-time equivalent basis for both the UW system and our technical college system. And so, you know, they're peaking 2011, thereabouts. And then since then, you see that they've collectively fallen about 12, 13% in Wisconsin. And here we can, you know, that's the overall decrease. And now in the next slide, we'll look at it on an institution basis. Okay, so overall about a 13% decrease, but it's not shared evenly. There are a handful of institutions that have seen, like UW-Madison, that have seen their enrollments increase over the past decade. And then there are a number of institutions that have seen declines, in some cases, pretty large declines. Those are particularly the case at our 2-year institutions. So if you look at our tech colleges and the former UW colleges, which grant associate degrees, you see there's where you're seeing the largest declines in enrollment. Now, even in the case where we're seeing some increase like Madison, that increase isn't necessarily keeping pace with other comparable, you know, flagship research institutions. Go ahead. Now, how does Wisconsin compare to other states? Well, this is by no means something that is exclusive to Wisconsin. As you can see, nationally, there's which is the light blue bar, you're seeing a pretty significant 6% drop in enrollment in 2-year and 4-year schools. But in Wisconsin, it's about double that. And if you look at Midwest states, particularly upper Midwest states, again, this is not some calamity that has only fallen on us. This is just the generalized demographics of our region and of our country, that we just simply have fewer of the kinds of people, such as high school graduates, that go into college. But it's something to bear in mind. It's a real pressure on our system. Okay, so we sort of talked about the funding challenge. We talked about the enrollment challenge. What's the effect of that? Well, here's one way of looking at the effect of that. Here are unrestricted balances that you could think of as reserves for the UW system. and we breaking out tuition reserves and other categories. The UW doesn't really have the ability to carry balances of state tax dollars. So these reserves of tuition are really notable. Now, part of the reason we got the tuition freeze in the first place is we had pretty significant increases in tuition during the 90s and through the Great Recession at a time when these tuition balances were growing. So, some members of the legislature said, hey, hold on a minute. Why is this happening during a recession? We shouldn't be building up balances at a time when families are struggling to pay their tuition. We need to move in a different direction. And so we got the tuition freeze. And as you can see, among some legislators, there was a concern about the level of the balances that we were carrying as a university system. And you can see that there's been, I think it's about 60%, there's been a significant decrease. So once again, another goal, direct or indirect, of the tuition freeze was to address this question of the balances. You can see that it is, they have fallen. Now, the timing of this, let's think about the timing of this. Obviously, heading into COVID-19, this was this great challenge, unexpected challenge, for which reserves, are one way that any institution can meet an unexpected financial challenge like a pandemic. And those were at lower levels heading into COVID-19 than they would have been, just 5 or 8 years earlier. And that was despite the fact that we had been, during the last decade, in one of the longest economic expansions of our country's history. All right. Here's another thing as we think about, well, what has been the possible effect of these funding challenges on the UW system and on its flagship, UW-Madison in particular. Let's look at R&D spending. This is a key indicator of the research activity of a university, and it's also important both for the federal dollars that it brings into our state, as well as the innovation it drives and the technology transfer and everything else that can benefit our economy. Here you see that since 2010, when they changed the federal survey a little bit, UW-Madison has increased its R&D spending by 17%. That's a little bit more than the rate of inflation. So, a pretty good increase. But when you look at other institutions, particularly other top institutions, we just simply haven't kept pace for UW-Madison. And that, as a result, has led to our ranking falling from, I believe, 3rd to 8th nationally. So again, we still, for the moment, compare very favorably with institutions like Harvard in terms of our R&D spending. And that's something I think that we can all be proud of as a state and really see a value in. At the same time, our stature has been eroding over time. All right. So obviously there's quite a bit of doom and gloom here that I've been giving you, but it's not all the case. And so there's a number of things that you can point to that, despite these, challenging funding and enrollment trends, the overall UW system and our flagship have been doing relatively well. I should say, since I'm speaking to a Milwaukee audience, if I had shown you the chart for UW-Milwaukee's R&D spending, the chart that I just showed you, that would have shown an even more challenging trend for UW-Milwaukee. It has, you can sort of think about how you interpret it, but certainly R&D spending has been no better than flat over the period that we looked at there for UW-Milwaukee. Okay, so back to the system and the positives. You can see here that both at the UW system and particularly at UW-Madison, you're seeing an increase in the graduation rates for students. And that's not just for white students, but it's also for underrepresented minority students. In particular, at UW-Madison, you have seen a narrowing of the gap between underrepresented minority students and there are others within the system. It certainly hasn't disappeared, but it has narrowed over time. All right, another big concern in recent years has been student debt levels. Here, we can see that over, the past 5 years, the average debt for someone graduating with a bachelor's degree has moderated, and on an inflation adjusted basis, even begun to fall modestly. That's particularly true at UW-Madison and in the system as a whole. As you can see, there still is an outstanding concern for UW-Milwaukee students who graduate with lower levels of debt. The other thing to be aware of is these are levels of debt for students who graduate. The students who don't graduate don't get a degree, and the increased earning power that provides, they're also someone, we need to look out for them as well. They're in some ways are the students who are in the worst position because they've incurred some of the cost of college, but not really gotten the full benefit. All right. So unfortunately, I still don't have for you the numbers that I would like to have in terms of what has been the impact of COVID-19, especially after you factor in these various rounds of federal aid. It is certainly the case that when you look at state government, when it gets into a budget situation, and particularly last year, we were very worried about the budget position we were in as a state. The state will do things called lapses, which, you don't need to worry about that term, but it essentially means spending cuts or other means to send money back to the state's general fund. The UW system, which has the largest number of employees of any state agency, really tends to be the agency that the state goes to first to get lapse money, to get these savings in the event of a recession. And that's been true this time around. It was true during the Great Recession. It was true after the bursting of the dot-com bubble. It's the lapses for UW's system as a whole, they're in the maybe 85, 86 million range, at least through June. That's the latest information that we've been told. If you look at just the overall impact to the UW system from the higher costs of responding to the pandemic, the revenues they've lost, whether it's the athletic revenues or revenues from students who didn't show up, and then you factor in the first round of CARES Act money, federal money that they got from legislation that passed in March of 2020. The overall system was down, they estimated, about $250 million as of September 30th. So that's the latest number that I've seen. Unfortunately, a lot has happened since. We've seen the worst months of the pandemic followed September 30th, but then we've also had 2 rounds of federal aid. There's the Consolidated Appropriations Act that President Trump signed in December, and then there's the American Rescue Plan that President Biden just recently signed. There's those are clearly going to, even the Consolidated Appropriations Act that doesn't get as much attention looks to me like it has more for the state's universities and colleges than the CARES Act did. And then this rescue plan that just recently passed is enormous. So, we really need to see better information over the next month or two about where the system is at when all these moving parts start to fall into place. And that's something that I would hope we would start to see by May or so. We'll also know by then what state tax collections are like, what the April tax return numbers look like, and that will be also really helpful to us in understanding better where the state is. All right. So when you look at the state, when you look at the decisions that lawmakers and the governor are going to make in the state budget process, which is already kicked off for the next 2-year budget that will start in July of this year and run through June of 2023, they'll be looking at addressing both the pandemic and these sort of historic challenges that have been building up for our higher education system. You know, in our report, we provided some options. Now, again, this report came out in December. It's not that long ago, but a lot has happened since then. And so, you know, I think one of the first questions will be what to do with this 2 rounds of funding that passed from the federal level since our report came out. You know, looking at what do we do with state tax dollars? What do we do with tuition? Looking at this question of enrollments, you know, how do we manage declining enrollment? How do we try and hold against it as best we can, whether that's online learning or doing a better job serving minority students that have just not enrolled in higher education at the same rates as white students, but who are now a bigger and bigger share of high school graduates. And then, you know, obviously, I think there's going to still be a need to find efficiencies within our system, whether that is through, again, through online learning, whether that's through more flexible governance and streamlined operations. I didn't talk to you as much today about the governance of the UW system, but we certainly have a very top-down system where all of the universities in the state, the public universities, are run through a single board of regents that also has authority for the flagship UW-Madison. You know, a lot of other peers to UW-Madison are not run that way. In Wisconsin, we don't give universities and colleges the ability to borrow on their own. Almost every other state gives higher education institutions some ability to do their own borrowing. The state manages construction projects for the UW system. That's not the case in a lot of other places. But at the same time, as you talk about those flexibilities, you have to think about what are the implications. You know, the UW system had sought to borrow money for operations within the budget. Now, will that still be the case once you factor in this additional federal aid? We'll see. Obviously, if you borrow money for your present operations, that's going to increase your costs long term, and there's clear trade-offs to that. So that runs through my presentation, and we tried to leave some time for questions. I see that they've been building up in the chat a little bit, so I'll start to turn that over, and feel free to add other questions to the chat as we talk.
Thank you, Jason. That was really quite a very thorough overview that really, I think, enhanced a lot of our understanding of what's going on with the state university system. And at this point, too, we welcome everyone to switch to gallery view so that you can see who's here and visit a little bit as well. Jason, first of all, just do you have some understanding of why enrollment is sagging?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it just comes down to demographics. And, well, I should say, it's a couple factors. One is simply demographics, that we just simply don't have the number of students graduating high school that we once did. Our birth rates in Wisconsin have been down, fertility rates have been down. So that's a major factor. That's true not just within the state of Wisconsin, but in the upper Midwest, in the region where other states might be sending students into Wisconsin. In addition to that, though, we have also seen some decline in post-secondary enrollment rates for students who complete high school. You know, so that's another thing to watch very carefully. The demographics also matter in the sense that we have been seeing the number of white students completing high school drop more precipitously than that of students of color, you know, but it's the white students who have traditionally enrolled at the higher rate. So, you know, that's one reason why, if we could find a way to better serve and better welcome students of color into our higher education system, that would be a win-win, both in terms of it would start to fill some of this unused capacity within our colleges and universities. It would, help to rectify just disparities in our society, and it would give us a more educated and productive workforce over the long term.
So a follow-up question is the drop in the two-year institutions, or the formerly, two-year institutions, was quite a bit more dramatic. Do you have some understanding of why that happened?
Well, I mean, it's a variety of factors, but one thing that we should watch here now that we've entered into this period of the pandemic is that there is more of a cyclical nature to two-year institutions. So, there is more of a tendency for people to try and increase their skills at two-year institutions when the economy is not doing well, and to not be as focused on that when there is more opportunity within the job market. And so to some extent, the recession that we've been in because of the pandemic may affect that. At the same time, the two-year schools are by their nature typically more hands-on in terms of their instruction and subject matter. And so there may also be some impacts to, a pandemic, which has called for social distancing on their operations. So, I mean, I think that's something to watch long-term. Another thing that I didn't mention when we think about our four-year schools is we have a very low rate, one of the lowest rates in the country, of students transferring from two-year schools to four-year schools. That's not all bad necessarily, because we do have very high rates of students completing a credential at the two-year level. So, if you're achieving your goals at a technical college, it's not necessarily bad that you're not going to a four-year school, but the rates are so low that I think that is one thing for us to look at as a state is, why are our transfer rates so low? And would there be some benefit to, at least in targeted areas, boosting the number of students who go from the technical college system into the UW system?
Thank you. Alex Chu asks, to what extent is the UW's relative funding status decline relative to its peers attributable to our better pension system?
That's a very insightful question. I think there is some of that there, in the sense that one of the states that you may have seen rise precipitously in that little animated bar chart is the state of Illinois. I think part of the funding increase in Illinois is a little bit of an illusion. Again, this is not really my area, what's happening down there, but it has been my impression that some of the efforts that have had to be taken to respond to their pension crisis may have sort of artificially boosted those funding levels. But again, I think the impact that you're seeing there is much more an impact of just state general fund spending and the tuition freeze and that's there, and that is there sort of independent of the enrollment, right? Because it's per student funding. So, it would look somewhat worse if we had the same number of students that we did before.
Bill Coleman asks, this would be looking at the chart when we looked at graduation rates. Who is classified as an underrepresented student?
I can get you the exact numbers, but I mean, it would be African-American students, Latino students, Asian students. And it's important to note that those are not monolithic groups. And so, the graduation rate or retention rate of African-American students or Asian students is not necessarily moving on the same track. And it is worth noting that for African-American students in particular, there are very great disparities in the state of Wisconsin that are unfortunately similar to some of the other disparities that we've seen in other aspects of our society.
Bill also asks how international students fit into the calculus of enrollment.
It's a great question. They should not be included in the underrepresented minorities. Just in general, it has certainly been the case that when you have a freeze on in-state undergraduates, it really matters whether, to what degree you can draw on out-of-state students. So an institution like UW-Madison that is very attractive to out-of-state students is going to be able to have certain tools to ride out a tuition freeze that an institution like UW-Stevens Point does not have. I can't speak to foreign students in particular, but it definitely is a case that the share of in-state students at UW-Madison has fallen over time, although officials from UW-Madison would point out that they continue to have as many students come in from within the state of Wisconsin, but their proportion of the total has dropped.
Matt Madsen says, as an adjunct at one of the system's campuses, we cannot ignore the impact of virtual and/or blended classes on the student population. While there are benefits to these alternative forms of instruction, certainly there's an impact in terms of quality and interaction that is suboptimal. In your opinion, how should the system embrace these new venues, and what is the impact on the budget as well as student tuition as we move into a more virtual form of education?
I mean, it's a great question. And one of our recommendations is that the state really have better data about the usage and outcomes of online learning, because I agree with the questioner that we can't simply assume that it will be as good and leap into it willy-nilly with no thought to the consequences. And I think we've seen that obviously virtual learning, I think, is a better fit for older students than for, say, people in the younger K-12 grades. But I think we've been seeing for K-12 schools what some of the impact of virtual learning has been. So the bottom line, during the 90s, the UW system also had enrollment challenges, and they did something called enrollment management to try and move students around to better reflect the supply of students and the capacity of the campuses to serve them. Online learning represents another tool to do that. I mean, we have some programs at different campuses where, maybe only a handful of students, as few as one or two, will graduate with a degree in that program as a first major in a given year. Now, there's a lot of things that you have to think about. You have to think about accreditation. You have to think about the costs versus the revenue you get for those students. But certainly one of the things to at least consider, and we didn't make any recommendations on this beyond studying it, but one of the things for the system to consider is whether they can better align where they have capacity with where they have students. And digital learning is a tool to do that didn't exist in the 1990s.
As we look at the fact that we have declining enrollments, what are your thoughts on consolidating campuses?
Sure.
This comes from Kaushal Shari.
Yeah. And that was something that we looked at specifically in the report, and I can cite numbers from it. The thing about it may be something that we, given all this federal money, doesn't really get consideration. It's been talked about for a long time, but nothing has ever come of it. We obviously have some campuses like the 13 former UW 2-year campuses that have very small numbers of students. I mean, 7, I think, of the 13 former UW colleges had less than 300 full-time equivalent students in 2019. So that is a very, small enrollments in some cases. At the same time, the thing about small colleges is that they're small. And so you don't necessarily get the savings that you would might think you would get from a campus closure. So UW-Superior, for example, when you look at their tax and tuition revenue in 2019, it was only about 1.1% of the total for the UW system. In other words, could there be some incremental savings that could be achieved through the real, I think, great political cost of going through a campus closure? Potentially, yes. There could be savings on the margins. Would they be transformational? I mean, that's in the eye of the beholder, but certainly they would be modest if you look at the overall pie, revenue pie or spending pie for the UW system.
Mark Stoddard says, with funding for property tax reductions in prisons increasing dramatically over the last 20 years, the average student now leaves school burdened with $25,000 to $35,000 in debt. Can you talk further about the relationship between those two trends?
Well, there's been several things that have driven the state's general fund and what happens over the past 20, 25 years. I mean, there's been state income tax cuts, to some degree, corporate taxes. There's been, again, the rise of K-12 funding. Medicaid in particular has risen so much. Property tax credits have also been up a lot. Prisons are up. And the reality is something's got to give, right? If you're going to give more to Sally, Jane or someone else is going to feel the effects of that. And so, if there were less spent on any of those priorities, or if certain tax cuts had not happened, would there be more funding available for the UW system? Potentially. At the same time, I think sometimes if you look at where polling suggests the public's priorities are and where lawmakers have set those priorities, they're not necessarily radically different. So, in some ways, what happens may simply reflect what all of us say to our elected officials that we want to have happen.
And Mary Bolick does point out that the student debt has leveled off, that we are at a more constant level at that as well. We didn't talk a lot about governance, but Steve Chevalier notes that the state has inordinate power over the system while contributing a small amount of support, relatively speaking. Do you agree with that observation, Jason, and compared to other states nearby?
I mean, I think that's basically a fair statement. I mean, if you look at some other states like Minnesota and Michigan, they have flagships with their own governing body, with there being some constitutional authority for higher education within the state. They're not necessarily part of a comprehensive statewide system. When you look at UW-Madison, it does not have a governing body of its own. It's governed by the UW regions. The regions have statutory authority. They don't have any constitutional authority. There's a large statewide system there. So if you're a regent, you need to be thinking about, a couple dozen 2-year and 4-year institutions around the state. You just simply by your legal mandate cannot focus on any one of them. And then obviously, when you look at borrowing or the tuition freeze or, certain things like procurement and building of facilities, construction management, we tend to be on the continuum of, more state involvement or less state involvement. We tend to be on the high state involvement side. Now, can there be more accountability with greater state involvement? Yes. At the same time, would there be times where having more flexibility might allow a flagship to, better manage its own operations for the unique goals of a public research institution? that could also be true, right? And so that's the tension, or that's the trade-offs of, the system that we have chosen, which is very centralized.
Abby Lang says, does Jason have any great suggestions to convince the legislature that additional state support is a good idea for the UW system?
Well, my former colleague at the Journal Sentinel, it's good to hear from you, Abby. I hope you're well. No, probably knows that it's not really our role. Obviously, though, I think here's one thing that I would say. When I talk to my two boys who are 19 and 15, one of them is already in college, and the other one will be, one of these days. It's just sort of a given that our family is going to make the investment, and it's a very great investment that our family is making to put them to get them a higher education. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I am fully convinced that it will be to their lifetime benefit that they get that higher education. And so I think it's, what the values that we apply to our own children, I think can very much apply for other people's children as well. Now, does that mean that everyone needs a degree in economics or something like that? No. I mean, a 2-year, there may be training in using a CNC machine that is wonderful training for the person who receives it and allows them to be productive for a lifetime. But, I do think that there are clearly benefits that we see in our private lives, and, sometimes debate to some greater or lesser degree in our public lives.
Thank you for that. We are nearing the end of our time, and we have two somewhat related questions here. So I'm just going to put them both out here for you. Pat Cronin says, back to campus consolidations, hypothetically, if the UW system closed Superior, would it save $100 million or so in operating costs?
Well, I can give you, I can quickly give you the number. I think it's about, 25 or 30 million. I'll give you the exact number here. Yeah, so UW Superior was budgeted in 2019 to get 28.8 million in state GPR, which is basically tax funding and tuition revenue. That was about 1.1% of the 2.6 billion in total the UW system expected to receive. Parkside down in Kenosha got 1.5%. Green Bay got 1.7%, to give you an example of several of the small 4-year campuses.
Okay. And then to wrap up, Dan Federley says, we've been talking largely about operating costs. What about capital costs? And, I think there was a pretty good capital plan that was put forward recently for the UW system.
Right. I mean, the UW system in the current 2-year state budget got a very large increase in capital funding. Now, to some degree, that caught the UW system back up with a couple budget cycles where there had been very small capital budgets. And, so in a sense, that was a catch-up budget. Going forward, once again, you're seeing a very large increase. I think it's about $1 billion in capital projects in this current 2-year plan. So far, and that for the UW system, I'm saying, so far there has been, I think, sort of caution or skepticism on the part of legislators of that. The UW does have a backlog of, I'm just looking at what the backlog in capital projects. UW-Madison officials have told me that they believe their backlog of maintenance and so forth is about 1.6 billion. It's a pretty rough estimate from what I can see of it, but it gives you a sense of what they are facing on the capital side.
Okay, and then one last question. John Hine wants to get your thoughts on whether the cost of a 4-year education always justifies whether the benefit of a 4-year education justifies the cost of a 4-year education. So just a soft question to end up on here, Jason. So
I'm really not an economist and can't speak to it. It's been my impression that I think there's been a little bit too jaundiced a view taken. I mean, it really depends on, I think, like so many things in life, like what higher education are you talking about? If you're talking about an expensive sort of for-profit private institution, it may or may not be something that pays out for the student. I think within the UW system, I think it's pretty clear that it does. And I certainly in my personal life am acting as if it does.
Okay.
When you look at what I'm doing with my checkbook. So.
Well, thank you, Jason. I think that we all have a much better understanding of what's been happening and what's likely to happen perhaps in the system going forward, at least in near term, because certainly there's a lot we don't know about how the funding coming in from the federal government is going to change things. But we greatly appreciate the time that you spent with us and all of the thorough work you did before you got here. I'm going to turn this back to Darren, but I have a message from Jim McLean that his sound is working. So I think we're going to be able to catch his invocation as we close out as well.
Thanks, Mary. Jason, Rob, thank you again for taking the time out of your day to be with us. We're huge fans of the Wisconsin Policy Forum here at Rotary, as you all know. It's always wonderful to have your updates delivered personally. So really appreciate the time you spent with us. In honor of leaders like yourself who speak to our club, we'll be donating to the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin in your name, whose mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Thank you both for being here. So with that, we would like to welcome back Jim McLean, Deputy Director with the Milwaukee VA Medical Center, to redeliver our invocation. Jim?
Oh.
Well, you look good, Jim.
I don't know, Jim, we may have to bring you back next week.
Well, we'll move on. Sorry, Jim. Thank you for all the extra effort. We'll make it happen again. Next Tuesday, join us to welcome Jesse Washington, an ESPN writer who had the honor of co-writing the autobiography of legendary Georgetown basketball coach, John Thompson. Should be a great program. With that, we will close our program with our Rotary Now More Than Ever video series featuring Karen Hung. Thank you all for being here today. Our meeting is adjourned.
Membership is choice, right? Who do I want and choose to engage with? How can I contribute and be part of something bigger than myself? And at this time, what I think is important about maintaining membership to Rotary is just given everything in our global and local context of what's happening in the world. And so with that, I think it's really vitally important to stay connected, to be connected, to lend voice, to participate, to understand and figure out how I can help individually and collectively as part of the Rotary organization contribute positively to the dialogue that's happening versus the divisiveness that's happening.